Hi, Alison. Thanks so much for making time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Micaela. It's a pleasure.
This is one of a series I've been interviewing people that I admire for their contribution, particularly to the family violence sector, because we're doing these for the Family Violence Leadership alumni newsletter. So I actually want to take this opportunity really to acknowledge, Alison, the incredible work that you've done at DV Domestic Violence Victoria in a range of leadership roles, including being the acting CEO. For how long did you hold that role?
13 months.
13 months, so just over a year. But the contribution you've made throughout the Royal Commission life cycle, really, both to the development of it, informing that incredibly complex piece of work, and the oversight of the implementation, you've held a really significant leadership role. I think the other thing I've observed you doing is the leadership around the merger of DVVic and DVIC, and the way that you and Emily Maguire worked so incredibly well collaboratively together to bring along women in Victoria, member organisations. So I want to acknowledge that was an incredible piece of work to observe.
Oh, thank you, Micaela.
Prior to working at DVVic, you've held roles in women's health, international aid, community housing, really extensive contribution across the community services sector. And something I've just learned about you that I think will have helped shape that, I would imagine, is that you spent most of your early years living overseas with parents who were aid workers. Whereabouts did you spend your early years?
I lived in Thailand when I was small, and through my teenage years we lived in Italy. And my parents also had lived in the South Pacific. They were in Tonga, and they lived in the Philippines for a while, so mostly outside of Australia.
When did you come back to Australia?
I came back when I was about 15 or 16, and didn't know a thing about what I should do as an Australian teenager. Had to make it all up.
I think one of the things, having spent 3 years living in Asia myself, that I found really interesting was understanding that concept of third culture, people who've got one foot in a range of different cultures. And I think what it is, the perspective you bring from that is very rich and valuable. What I wanted to ask you, what I'm really curious about, Alison, given the perspective that you've had across the Family Violence Royal Commission since it was announced in 2015, what you see as the most significant changes that have come about in that time?
Look, I think it's really worth thinking about the year or two that led us into the Royal Commission, really, Micaela. I think, in 2013 and 2014, we saw something quite extraordinary in Victoria, which was we'd had a spate of quite high-profile family violence homicides, which, of course, were, punctuated really clearly by Luke Batty's death in February 2014 and the advocacy role that Rosie quickly adopted after that. But what we were really seeing was that we had media reporting and journalists that were reporting on the issue of family violence in a way that they'd never done before. So they were making the links, and they were talking about the structural drivers, and they were talking about this issue of male violence against women and children in a way that I don't think we'd ever seen before. And of course, the way the media reports on the issues of family violence and of violence against women really shapes how the community understands the issue. So I think what we saw that year, and of course it was an election year, was that there was this incredible growth of community understanding about the impact that family violence has on the lives of Australian women, on Australian children and our most marginalised communities, and the extent to which it limits their rights to live lives free from fear and violence. And so what we saw was really significant in an election year, because the Victorian community was kind of very clearly saying, this issue is a number one social policy issue and it's a number one law and order issue. I think Dan Andrews had made a commitment when he was in opposition that if the ALP was successful in the 2014 election, that they would call a Royal Commission. And of course, that was one of the first things that his government did early 2015. So the Royal Commission then occurred and had a very broad terms of reference that enabled a root and branch exploration of the way that we prevent and respond to family violence in Victoria. That, of course, has led to a really significant tranche of recommendations that we're still in the process of implementing, and in some respects are still kind of, a lot of those things are long-term pieces of work, and in some respects we're sort of only at the very beginning of some of the really, really big picture reforms. But and of course, the government's decision over 3 budgets, I think 3 main budgets, to kind of really significantly invest in meeting those recommendations, of course, has enabled us to kind of do the work that we've done subsequently. But I think probably, one of the key expectations that the Royal Commission established was that family violence is now everybody's business. So family violence is not an issue that can any longer occur behind closed doors, that actually the state has a very key role in its prevention and responding to it, and in protecting people's safety. But that, there is a role for a really, really broad range of professionals in health, in community sector, in education, in private business, for example, in recognising and responding to the red flags. And I think that's probably, been one of the most significant parts of the reforms.
I agree. I will never forget seeing newspapers with the tally at the top of numbers of women dying. I was speaking at a conference in Vietnam when the Royal Commission was underway, and trying to explain to women in Asia about the changes in the Australian kind of approach to an understanding. It was very hard to explain and understand because people were counting as well. It was being counted and acknowledged and talked about all the time. Alison, how are you seeing that play out now during the pandemic? One of the first things a lot of us in the community sector were hearing as it was coming out of China was that dramatic increase in family violence and the concerns about what would happen. And it's played out a bit differently than that. What are you seeing about how that is both playing out in the community and in services?
I think the fact that when the pandemic hit Australia, we were, of course, a few weeks behind, some other parts of the world where we could kind of observe those trends, including the increase in reported rates of family violence. It was really interesting to me that there was such intense focus in those early weeks on the safety of victims of family violence with the lockdown restrictions and with the social isolation measures that we had to put in place. So I think, that really spoke to the fact that family violence is still this issue that is front of mind for people, because there was really, really intense focus on what would happen. I think what we saw out was probably a slightly different trend to what we were hearing about in other parts of the world, where we did see, early in the first weeks of the pandemic, a dip in people reaching out for support. And I think there was some issues in terms of the messaging, where people have assumed that services weren't open for business, or we've steadily returned to pre-pandemic levels of engagement with clients. But of course, the family violence service system has had to adapt really, really quickly to working in different ways and to engaging with and to reaching their clients in different ways. So we're seeing really significant shifts from people using telephone-based services, for example, to web-based systems. Our suspicion is that that's probably because of, when people are in isolation with perpetrators, that they're having to look for different ways of engaging with the service system.
Yeah. And I think I was reading something earlier about, rather than kind of thinking about first, second, third, thinking about things in terms of 4 waves, and that the third wave that we still have to see is the increasing complexity of people, of the needs, because of the inability to step in and intervene at an earlier stage, and that things will escalate. So I think it's been incredible seeing and hearing the way you, DVIC, family violence organisations have adapted, often with inadequate resources to do that, not big organisations with lots of resources at their disposal to do that. And I really want to kind of thank and acknowledge your leadership in supporting a lot of those organisations through that time, because I think it's been challenging and we've got a long way ahead of us. So, and there is increasing complexity coming. So I just really want to thank you, Alison. It's been a pleasure throughout this time observing your leadership and working collaboratively with you. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Micaela. It's a pleasure.
Lots more to talk about, so we'll keep talking with you.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.